Yeah, we're going live right now, and I think we're live now. And hey, guys, welcome back to another episode of the Typical Skeptic podcast. I literally have one of my favorite guests. I literally said I think James Bartley is one of the best UFO, if not the best UFO researchers we have, because he can blend old school ufology and old school alien abduction cases with things that are going on currently, like the MILAB abductions and reptilians and the Black Ops projects. And I always say, to know where we're going, you have to know your history. You know what I mean? And that's what's great about James. He knows his history, but he's very well in tune with current events and what's going on today. And today we're going to get into a little bit of everything, and from reptilians to MILABs to Black Ops projects and Rendlesham Forest. A little bit more about my guest. James Bartley is a lifelong researcher and investigator into the dark world of MILABs, which are military abductions, Reptilian Overlords, and underground black operations. As the host of the Cosmic Switchboard Show, he explores how covert military and extraterrestrial programs intersect with human consciousness, hybridization, and psychic warfare. James brings decades of direct experience or testimony to the field of research, from UFO hotspots like RAF Bentwaters, which we'll talk about today, and Rendlesham Forest, to the site of Britain's most famous UFO encounter. He ties together reptilian control systems, MILAB abductions, and government mind control and spiritual warfare in a way that few people can, drawing from firsthand witness accounts and inspired perspectives. And I'd like to give him a big warm welcome back to the show. James, thanks so much for coming back on, man. How are you?
Pretty good, buddy. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So we were going to get a little bit more into Rendlesham today and the RAF Bentwaters. And I know there's the new documentary, Capel Green, right? So where did you want to go with that?
Well, Capel Green is under a lot of attack, and some of the main players of the documentary are under attack right now. Ever since the documentary came out, the powers that be have done everything they can to shut it down. And once again, we have the familiar specter of the retired Colonel Charles Halt coming on to once again smear Larry Warren's character, or try to. And he did this on Ross Coulthart's show, which kind of gives you an idea of where he stands in all this. You're either for exposure and disclosure, or you're part of the cover-up, right? And once again, right on cue, Colonel Halt rocks up and starts smearing Larry again, and simultaneous to that, the directors and producers of the Capel Green documentary start to get harassed. And one of the key facets behind this harassment is the insistence on removing clips of retired Colonel Halt talking about aliens. And this shows the utter hypocrisy of it all, because on the documentary, you have Colonel Halt openly saying that aliens were seen inside the base, within the perimeter of the base, that aliens had been seen near a certain building, right? So Why is it okay for Colonel Halt to say this, but it's bad for Larry Warren? And he wasn't the only witness. He wasn't the only participant out there at Capel Green, the clearing in Rendlesham Forest. Why is it bad to say that a landed craft was seen outside of the base in the woods, in a clearing, and aliens were seen outside of this landed craft? And in fact, the deputy wing commander, Colonel Gordon Williams, who later became a general, was present and met face-to-face with these aliens. Why is that bad, but it's okay for Colonel Halt to talk about aliens being seen within the perimeter of the base, right by a building? In fact, he pointed out which building it was in the documentary. So they want that part of the documentary chopped off. But I wanted to bring the viewers' attention to another aspect that involves Colonel Halt, a couple of other aspects, as well as some of the things that happened to Larry Warren underground in his encounter with an alien. He was taken beneath the base and suffered 2 days of missing time. Okay, so let's backtrack to the work of one of the great old school MUFON researchers, Ray Boucher. Bouche. He was one of the key investigators in the early days of the Rendlesham Forest RAF Bentwaters series of incidents. He compiled a dossier, a report about 345 pages long of notes and witness statements he'd obtained. He was getting nowhere as far as interesting the general public, obviously, but also other UFO researchers, because even back then the clampdown on RAF Bentwaters was really being imposed. So he decided, because he lived in Nebraska, he decided to ask the office of the Senator James Exon, EXON, if they would look into the matter of Rendlesham Forest. And so they provided Senator Exon's office with information, copy of the HALT tape, a copy of the HALT memorandum, and it should be remembered that if it wasn't for Larry Warren, we wouldn't have a HALT tape. We wouldn't have the Ministry of Defense document tried out via the information, the Freedom of Information Act. That was all Larry's doing and the people that Larry was working with, right? So we got to get that out in the open first of all. And what Ray Boucher did was he told the staffers and Senator Exon what had happened, what he'd managed to piece together at Rendlesham Forest. And in a nutshell, this is what he said, echoing what Larry Warren and others said, that a craft had landed in the forest, military personnel surrounded the vehicle, there was British constables present, film, motion picture film, and the VHS videotape technology of the time, big bulky cameras, were utilized to film the landed craft, the occupants coming out of the craft, and the encounter between Colonel Gordon Williams and the aliens. Larry Warren was within touching distance of this landed craft. And this information was provided to Senator James Exon's office, Senator of Nebraska. So what Ray Boucher did was he called up Colonel Halt, and he wrote down a verbatim account of what he and Colonel Halt had discussed. Ray Boucher said that we want to, in so many words, and I'm paraphrasing him, we want to get this information through to Senator James Exon, and would you be willing to talk to Senator James Exon and his staff about what you know about Rendlesham Forest? And Ray Boucher recounted to Colonel Charles Halt what evidence he'd amassed so far, what I just told you. Yeah. Landed craft in a clearing, aliens coming out, Colonel Gordon Williams meeting the aliens, film being taken, Colonel Gordon Williams being driven to the airfield and boarding a 2-seat fighter plane with the motion picture film in hand in a canister, flew off to Germany, okay? And then all that was related to Halt, and Halt said, I can substantiate all of that. I can confirm all of that to Senator Exon's office. Now, that is in Perry Mason terms, if you remember that old school American courtroom drama TV
I remember
series.
Perry Mason, yeah.
That's what we call damaging testimony. That is the part in the series when someone in the audience screams, no, I didn't do it. It wasn't me, right? So here's Colonel Halt. He's on the documentary being filmed saying, oh, yeah, there was an alien over there. But Larry Warren is a liar for saying aliens landed outside the base. And then here he is, Ray Boucher, this venerable old school MUFON researcher, quotes him as saying, I can substantiate everything to Senator Exon's office. Everything you said, the film being taken, Colonel Williams meeting with the aliens, Colonel Williams being driven to the airfield, canister in hand, film canister in hand, flying off to Germany in a fighter plane, a 2-seat fighter plane. the military personnel there, all that he can confirm, right?
Yeah.
So what we have here is a clear example of utter hypocrisy and duplicity. And Colonel Holt, or retired Colonel Holt, if you're listening or if you're watching, and if your minders are watching, this is a cease and desist. Because at this point, clearly, you are on the wrong side of history. At this point, clearly, you are not part of disclosure. You are part of the cover-up. And anyone who gives him a forum at this point, has been for some time, but certainly going forward in this age of disclosure we're in, you're part of the cover-up too. And look at the difference in the treatment meted out to Larry Warren, Steve Longero, who was also part of that interview by Ross Coulthart. Ross Coulthart tried to make out Larry once again to be a liar. But then after the documentary comes out, then he has Colonel Holt come on to smear Larry once again. Okay, so we clearly see where Ross Coulthart stands in all this. Okay, here's another thing about Colonel Holt. After Larry got out of the Air Force, eventually he was hypnotically regressed by none other than Bud Hopkins in New York City.
Wow.
And what came out of the regression was, get this, and I'm going to get into more detail on this because it dovetails into all the other stuff we're talking about, deep black military human collusion with aliens, okay? Because that's a big part of the Rendlesham story, which up till now has been pretty much kept under the rug. Larry was regressed. In the regression, among other things, when he was taken underground by these really spooky characters, okay, on the surface, he was told to meet somebody on the surface of the base, and basically he was shanghaied. They sprayed his face with this aerosol can that rendered him listless and weakened. And other MILABs and other people have told me about this same spray. This is very old school. I didn't hear about this knockout spray till the 90s, late 90s. Larry was talking about this in 1980, 81 timeframe. Keep that point in mind. So he and Adrian Bustinza were told to meet at a certain place. They were both sprayed with this aerosol spray, rendered listless, chucked into a sedan that had all these bright green lights on the dashboard, unlike anything Larry had seen before. And I've heard similar accounts on the surface where people looked into these very spooky sedans that would show up at UFO hotspots, and likewise they would see control panels and all kinds of weird stuff where a normal dashboard should have been. So Larry and Adrian were stuffed into the vehicle. They eventually wound up underground. And what came out in the regression was, and it was all taped, the regression was taped, Larry was mentioning by name a number of other Air Force personnel who had likewise been drugged and taken underground. During regression, he was naming, there's so-and-so, there's so-and-so, there's so-and-so, naming them by rank and name. And what happened was, Larry Warren's erstwhile co-writer, let's call him that, another name for that would be turncoat. I'm not going to dignify him by mentioning his name, right? He got a hold of the audio tape of the regression where Larry, among other things, was naming names of the drugged fellow Air Force personnel he'd seen underground. That audio tape went from Bud Hopkins to Larry's co-writer at the time, who later did a 180 and stabbed Larry in the back. And then that co-writer, who I shall not name, turned around and gave that audio cassette to none other than the retired Colonel Charles Holt. And it has since disappeared. All right. So we're talking strike. By now, any normal strike zone, the guy would be out, right? Colonel Holt.
Yeah.
And if you look at what happened to Larry, and my rendering of the account doesn't do it justice. I didn't want to read the account verbatim out of the book because that would be too tedious for your listeners. So I'm going by memory. The last time I was on here, I forgot about this key part of Larry's story. And a big part of that, and I remember it happening. I read about it and I was astonished by the revelation, but I hadn't read Larry's book since because I had a mental block about it. And here's why. I have a real issue with treachery. I have a real issue with betrayal. It's part of my Scorpio dragon nature, right?
Yeah.
So when I came on here last time and I talked about Rendlesham, one of my colleagues from Holland, I don't have liberty to mention his last name, but he's a researcher in our field in the Rendlesham forest issue. Hans is his first name. He copied and pasted a number of excerpts from Larry's book, and he posted them in a thread on Facebook, right, where I put up a link for my last interview with you, and it refreshed my memory. And because I had such a mental block about going back to that book because of the treachery that was meted out to Larry, by his co-writer, and I'd actually been a roommate of this unnamed co-writer at the Roswell conference, and you can see a video of me giving my reptilian presentation in Roswell back in 2007. Well, this co-writer was roomed with me, and we actually had a discussion for a while. I actually was considering doing some work with this guy. I'm glad I never did. Something told me not to. Okay, so the long and the short of it was Larry was taken underground. He'd seen one of the craft in this underground base that was very similar in appearance to the craft he and the 40 or 50 other military personnel had surrounded in that clearing. Okay, it was inside this base that was jointly occupied by these aliens and by the military, deep black elements of the military. You saw these people in orange hazmat suits, men and women, not hazmat suits, but like laboratory type outfits, but they were a strange orange color. And he and Adrian Bustinza were made to sit in very comfortable seats like you would find at a theater. And they had this view screen in front of them that was very well lit up. And behind it was a silhouette of presumably an alien. And the moment that alien appeared behind the screen, Larry and probably Adrian Bustinza were both immobilized and could not turn their heads. They were just forced to look straight at this bright screen with this mysterious silhouette figure behind it, at which point this entity behind the screen, began telepathically talking to Larry, right?
Wow.
And it told him a number of things. Now, first of all, as he was being led, still in a drug state, he recalls one of the security personnel that was leading him down there to his destination, a guy dressed up in a black SWAT type suit, was saying tunnel entrances led out to the North Sea, from the base, right? Larry got the impression they were very deep underground. And these tunnel entrances, as explained by this alien later to Larry, was one of the means with which these aliens were able to go in and out of the base. They go into the North Sea, enter into a tunnel system, and pop up in this underground base, right? That was one of the means that they used. But anyway, this alien told Larry that there's no point me telling you where I'm from in so many words, because I come from a world that is beyond your comprehension. And Larry didn't know if he meant, well, is he from another planet, another dimension? It just was really mysterious and strange. And remember, Larry's in this, drugged out state, and this being is getting right into his head with all these statements. This being went on to tell him that, and he named some of the major international players at the time. He said the governments of the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union at the time, and Japan, and I have to go and check to see if he mentioned any other countries in Europe. He said that at the highest levels, they've all been interacting with aliens, for lack of a better term, right? The alien went on to tell him that his particular species had been at that base, that underground base, since the 1940s. Okay. Now, is he suggesting the alien? It is suggesting that his species had been there since the 1940s, or they'd been working with the deep black military there, deep beneath RAF Bentwaters. And there was twin bases, RAF Bentwaters, Rendlesham Forest in the middle, then RAF Woodbridge, right? And deep beneath both bases, essentially, was this alien base. And that alien told Larry, we'd been there since the 1940s. Now, did he mean to imply they've been working with the humans since the 1940s? We don't know. He wasn't that specific, or Larry doesn't recall that point. The alien did tell him, for your own security, you will not remember everything, but try to remember anyway, right? So just that statement alone, telepathically given, that we, this particular group of aliens, had been there since the 1940s, potentially, possibly already interacting with deep black elements of the military and the government back then, but we don't know that for sure. But we can only go by what we know from similar cases around the world. That this interaction, as you know, Robert, because I consider you to be a main player in all this, has been going on for a long, long time. And the waters are further muddied by when you enter time travel, time manipulation into the equation. Just how long does this chronology go back of this interaction between deep black elements of the government, of the military, of secret societies with non-human life forms, right? So Hans, this researcher from the Netherlands, he drew my attention to this discussion, which I'd forgotten about. I remember small snippets of it, but I forgot the depth and the extent of the discussion, right? And one really has to read that part of the book to get a broader understanding what I'm trying to convey here. But Larry pointed out when I first met him in the early 1990s, and this is the early 1990s, he was saying, now everyone's talking about underground bases and aliens in underground bases, and the military in underground bases. I lived through it. I experienced it in late December 1980. And if you zoom out and look at it in a broader context, okay, you have Pat Price's revelations. If you remember Pat Price's story, he was one of the top remote viewers, Stanford Research Institute, and later that started working with the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA. And whether it's from an oversoul perspective, whatever the case may be, his consciousness was attracted to 3 alien bases in particular, one of which was Mount Hayes, the underground base beneath Mount Hayes in Alaska. When we talk about the Alaskan Triangle, the disappearances of people, disappearances of aircraft, the huge alien presence there, cryptids running amok in the wilds of Alaska, the whole 9 yards, right? Well, Pat Price's attention was driven to this underground base beneath Mount Hayes in Alaska. And what was Pat Price saying in the early 1970s? There's a joint alien military base there. The aliens are working in conjunction with deep black elements of the military scientific community. And you zoom out further, right? My friend, the late great Helga Morrow, her father was a scientist, Frederick Augustus Kephars. One of his jobs working for the aerospace giants was to help human-looking aliens assimilate into human society, right? So we have the Dulcie story, which I have no reason to not believe, right? Because some of the researchers I knew back in the day had been in comms personally with Thomas Costello, the RAND security specialist, who'd escaped with a cache of documentation of still and video evidence, because he was the RAND security specialist beneath Dulcie Base, Section D. That's what the Department of Energy called it. And he had video and still footage, film of aliens in the underground base, right? So he went on the run after escaping from Dulcie. So there's a lot of stories about this. So point being is, if the deep black military was involved in this late December 1980 with aliens at Rendlesham Forest beneath RAF Bentwaters. That cast a whole new light on this so-called disclosure movement now. Bentwaters, RAF Bentwaters, and witnesses like Larry Warren should be the first ones to be subpoenaed by Congress. Along with Bob Lazar, along with Donald Schmidt, the great Roswell researcher, they should be front and center, right, to add historical context to all this. But in true communist fashion, what they've managed to do is draw a line of demarcation, if you will. You have the TikTok videos, and then this plethora of whistleblowers, and I give them credit. A lot of them are getting harassed, and they're going through a lot of the crap that Larry went through way back when, Larry and others. Pat Price paid for this because he was murdered, assassinated, basically, right?
Yeah.
So once again, they made it seem as if all this started with the TikTok videos. All this started with the USS Nimitz air group encounters with UFOs. All this started in the recent past with naval aviators running into UFOs along the eastern seaboard of the U.S., right? Well, it didn't start then. It was going on way back then. So I really encourage people to really sink your teeth into RAF Bentwaters, because once again, they've tried and failed to marginalize Larry, to smear his reputation. And it should be remembered, Larry was the only person thus far that has been subjected to a polygraph test by a world-class polygraph operator. And we see the results in the documentary, right? He passed with flying colors. Okay, let's see Colonel Halt get fluttered, as they say in the CIA, i.e. given a polygraph test. Let's see what comes out. I would write up a list of questions, right? Because what's come out in the testimony of a number of the witnesses besides Larry was Colonel Halt was out there. He was out there in Rendlesham Forest in a different part of the field, going through his own jollies, right? And people had seen Larry there. Greg Battram, Steve Longero, there's a number of witnesses who'd seen Larry out at the clearing, the staging ground, and then the clearing at Capel Green. They'd seen him. He was a participant. That's absolutely a fact. But instead, we have these non-entities, these Nick Popes, these Colonel Charles Halts, and this horde of trolls that have been attacking Larry all this time. And it should be remembered, Larry was one of those military witnesses who came forward, and I give credit where credit's due. Stephen Greer's press conference at the Washington National Press Club way back then, right around 2002, 2004, that time frame. Larry was one of those people that gave testimony. One of my personal friends, Guy Kirkwood, was an F-86 fighter pilot in the 1950s. He and 3 other pilots were trained to intercept UFOs and photo document the intercept with gun camera film, which they did at least on 3 occasions, right? And he was prepared to go to give testimony. The day before he was set to leave, some anonymous person called him and said, if you leave, you won't have a house to come back to because we're going to burn your house down. And he lived in South County, San Diego, El Cajon, right? I lived in San Diego at the time. I knew Guy very well, right? Now, imagine if Guy Kirkwood's testimony rolled out right now, right? Where in the 1950s, he and others were tasked with intercepting UFOs and photo documenting the intercepts via gun camera film, right? How does that square today with all these ex-fighter pilots and ex-military people saying that, oh, well, really implying, not coming out and saying it, but implying, oh, this only started with the Tic Tac videos and, the USS Nimitz battle group encounter, right? So, no, it's been these kinds of intercepts and UFO film footage have been going on for a long time. But yeah, you had a point.
Yeah. I wanted to bring up something. I got into an argument like a couple months ago with someone, and I'm not even going to say who it was, but it was about the Paul Bennett, and this ties into everything you're saying. I'm not going off course here. I got into an argument with someone about the Paul Bennewitz case and Rick Doty. They were saying, well, you should just hear Rick Doty out and give him a chance. I was like, I don't need to. And I brought up your name. I said, you can ask James Bartley. I was like, they ruined that man's life. I was like, I don't think Rick Doty should be getting credit at conferences. But Paul Bennewitz ties into what you're saying, right? Like he was seeing this stuff.
Absolutely ties into what I'm saying. It was around the same time frame, right?
Yeah.
The late 1970s, early 1980s, right? When they did that number on Paul. And it should be reminded, but that Doty not only, pulled this all-out spectrum warfare on Paul Bennewitz. I mean, the record speaks for itself, right? But look what he did also to Linda Moulton Howe. He did a bait and switch on her. Oh, we're going to give you all this information, and then the information doesn't show up. It's just classic bait and switch. But it's that communist tradition of wiping out the past. Rick Doty has played a key role in maintaining this cover-up, and now like he morphs into this whistleblower. And I remind people what Paul Bennewitz was talking about. Paul Bennewitz was an independent scientist and a researcher who obtained lots of film footage as well as recordings of what he felt were alien communications emanating out of the Sandia mountain range, right? Where there was an underground base. Now, coincidentally, another whistleblower, the late great, he was the guy Schneider was
Phil Schneider.
Phil Schneider was the geologist working for the U.S. government, and his job was making underground bases, basically, right? In those same Sandia mountains, he was lowered down into an underground cavern system where he had an encounter with gray aliens, and he was shot with some kind of light beam, which was described, a similar type of light beam, a light gun, ray gun, had been described by Thomas Costello at the Dulce base, Section D, right? And you saw what happened to Phil Schneider, right? He got suicided. Yeah. And when you look at him at his wounds, his parts of his hand were missing. You can tell that his chest was ripped open, right, by something. And basically, he got blasted by a ray gun by an alien. And he said that military personnel, security personnel, had saved his life at the expense of their own, right? And we've heard stories about the Dulce Wars. We've heard stories about conflict at S4 Area 51 between humans and the non-human elements, let's say. And getting back to Bennewitz very quickly, Rick Doty played a key role in trying to discredit him, put out the silly notion that all the alien activity was meant to fool Bennewitz, and it was a psyop to make him think that it was all about aliens, when what was really going on in places like Sandia National Labs, the Sandia Corporation, to cover up the fact that they were doing advanced beam weapon testing. Well, that's a non-starter, because as far back as 1950, we know that Dr. Robert Sawbarker had told Wilbert Smith, a Canadian government scientist, that the subject of aliens and UFOs was the most highly classified subject in the U.S. government at that time, which is 1950. He said it was, Robert Sawbarker said it was 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb, which had, at that time, they were starting to develop the hydrogen bomb. I always wonder what was like 1 point below the, UFOs. If it was 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb, well, what was it just above, right? But, relevant to the story is, if Doty is saying 30 years later that, oh no, the UFOs was a smokescreen to distract from what was really going on, advanced weapons testing, no. We've already determined by Dr. Robert Sawbarker, who wrote that letter to William Steinman, the author of UFO Crash at Aztec, which is one of the great classic gem research books in our field. And Robert Sawbarker had stated that to Wilbert Smith, aliens and UFOs and the back engineering of the technology is the most highly classified subject there is. So saying that the UFOs were used as a smokescreen to distract from advanced weapons testing, that's a non-starter. Okay, that's going backwards, right? So Rick Doty was behind that. So this is an example of people who don't do their history, and Paul Benowitz should be remembered by every researcher today, because he was talking about an active underground base beneath Sandia Mountains, not too far from Sandia Base, not too far from Los Alamos, and the whole Kirtland, Los Alamos, Sandia complex. And I had a message I asked Daryl James, a mutual friend, Daryl James, because I'd always felt that either they accidentally or they intentionally built these underground bases beneath deeper pre-existing alien bases deep within the cavern systems of the planet, right? And that's what Daryl said. He said, well, he was given to understand that when they build these underground bases, they tend to put them on top of pre-existing bases, which makes sense to me. And I felt something like that was going on. So you have Daryl's operation going on there at Cornwall. We have what's going on at RAF Bentwaters. It's like in a straight line. That's not too far. England is not that big of a country, right? So just right off the bat, you have these two major events going on there in Daryl's operation there that he was involved in, as well as what Larry went through. So you can see where the twain meets, that there has been this ongoing collusion between aliens and deep black elements of the military. It's ongoing. They will never go in this direction with these faux congressional hearings. Everything's supposed to be new. They're trying to mystify everything, throw this new jargon at us, right? Oh, biologics. Oh, you mean alien bodies? No, they're alien bodies. That's what we've called them all along, right? UAPs. No, they're UFOs. The UFOs was an official government term for it, right? But again, they're trying to mystify everything. They're trying to cloud the issue, trying to move the goalposts and make it seem like this is all new, trendy, and sexy. Well, it's not new, trendy, and sexy, because as we've seen in the Full Disclosure Conference, some of us have been taken off world, right? Some of us have been using these horrendous mind control programs that involved aliens, and it wasn't just mind control and drugs to make us think that. That's what these surface level types all think. Oh, these people think they're having encounters with aliens. They're just, that's just government mind control. They don't know the half of it, right? So anyhow, any direction you want to go.
You brought up a good point. Because a lot of surface. You say they're surface level. They'll deny alien abductions as well. They'll try to say. I don't know if you heard this, but they'll try to say that it's all the government doing alien abductions, and that And I'm like, this was a worldwide phenomena that was happening for massive amounts of years. Like at least from what we know from the 40s, 50s, 60s onward until now, it doesn't seem to be as prevalent now. It seemed like it maybe died off a little bit, but I think there's still people complaining of being taken by aliens, but like it seemed to be
it's still happening. Yeah, it's still happening.
Yeah. But like, do you know what I'm talking about? Do you hear that from people? That people think it's all the government, and that they'll even go as far as to say that the government used people to dress up in costumes like aliens and abduct people.
Well, the thing is, they have done things like that, but there's no way it can explain away the totality of the syndrome of how many people, multi-generations of families, have had alien abduction encounters going back on. There are family histories, oral testimony going back generations. My grandfather and grandmother talked about these things. My great-grandfather talked about these things. And we now know, thanks to the great work of some of the great abduction researchers, past and present, that this is definitely multi-generational, right? So again, it's an example of them trying to wipe out the past. And so many people, like Alex Jones, I consider him a spent force these days, as far as surface level investigations are concerned. He's back on the bandwagon. You're warning about a fake alien invasion. It's the real players in our field. We didn't get worked up into a mouth foaming lather about Atlas 3I, right? Because we know that there's been gigantic planet-sized ships imaged in front of the sun. We know there's been huge craft right above Earth, right outside the atmosphere. The late great Major Donald Kehoe, his sources in the Pentagon in the 60s were telling him that they're alarmed by the fact that there had been these huge spacecraft that had taken up like orbit outside of the planet. They were just there. There was nothing they could do about it, right? So, yeah, and a couple of points I want to make about this, and it's all related. I'm going to be talking more about this in an upcoming podcast on someone else's show. The issue of Thomas. Oh man, it's early in the morning, but he was Theodore von Karman, the U.S. Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, also known as the Scientific Advisory Group, chairman, and worked closely with Majestic 12. He had formed a NATO version of the Scientific Advisory Group, right? And it was embedded into the NATO command structure. And it makes me wonder, because if you go over and you scrutinize the Majestic documents that you see on Ryan Wood, Robert, his father, great researcher of the past, passed away, and Ryan Wood, I've had him on my show before, on the Majestic documents website. If you look up the 5th annual report of Majestic 12, and you go down to about the 22nd point that they're making, right? There's a little one-line blurb there where MJ4, Majestic 4, had authorized Dr. Theodore von Karman to begin AGARD. AGARD is Advisory Group Aerospace Research and Development, AGARD, and that was the NATO operation, the NATO scientific branch of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Group. Von Karman was giving his blessing to do so by General Nathan Twining and General Hoyt Vandenberg. So here we have a guy, Theodore von Karman, who worked closely with alien technology and who came out of those. He was the world's leading aerodynamicist, aerospace physicist, scientist, and he went to all the top schools in Europe, and he knew personally the top airplane designers and other people like him in Europe. So it makes me wonder, when I was sitting there watching Jean Moyen talk about his experiences as a young boy, taken underground beneath France, interacting with mantis beings and aliens and deep black military, I'm thinking, does this have something to do in some way? Because we know how international this effort is, right? This off-world alien-human interaction that's been going on. Did AGARD have anything to do with that? And I have to wonder, because if AGARD got started in the early 1950s, right? And then I'm not sure what time frame Jean Moyen describes, maybe the 1960s or 1970s, when all this stuff happened to him as a boy. That would have given Theodore von Karman and his ilk plenty of time to set up similar programs in Europe if they hadn't already been started, right? Because as that alien pointed out to Larry Warren, at the highest levels of the Japanese, British, Soviet Union, they've already been interacting with aliens, right, for some time. So did Theodore von Karman start AGARD, Advanced Advisory Group, Aeronautical Research and Development? Did he start that group in NATO with the mind to eventually interact with colleagues he'd known for decades, before World War II even, and privately pulled people aside and said, this is what we need to do. We need to get this operation going? Because it seems to me, Robert, and I'd like your thoughts on this, if they're going to be talking to some of these survivors of the various early crashes, Roswell, others, and there's a video out there, and I've asked Michael Schratt to come back on my show. I haven't heard back from him, but in recent podcasts Michael Schratt's been doing, he was aware of, and so was Leonard Stringfield and others that he's drawn his research from, of 6 or 7 or more crashes even before Roswell. So Roswell is a tip of the iceberg. There were a number of crash retrievals before that. Absolutely. So they already
there were hundreds of them. It's like, when you look into the Stringfield material, it seems like Leonard Stringfield documented hundreds of like UFO cases. And then if you talk to like another good one that I think would be good for your show is Andrea Martin from her channel is called Growing Up Alien. She's like a Pleiadian walking, but she's very good with like blending the old school material as well. And I know she brought Frank Chile on my show, which I wasn't familiar with Frank Chile before, but he brings a lot of good information. But where I was going with that was Andrea talks a lot about like a lot of the Italian UFO researchers and stuff like that who brought up the crash retrievals that happened over there and stuff like that,
Well, yeah, as far back as 1933, and that's a whole backstory, because the Archbishop, whose name the Pope, whose name escapes me at the moment, he had personally given an award given to very few people to Colonel, later General William Donovan, who was Irish Catholic, and I think he was a Knight of Malta. And the Pope had given him this special decoration. William Donovan, of course, created the Coordinator of Information, which later became the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. And we now know that the craft that was obtained by the Italians in 1933, and this has come out recently in some of this David Grush testimony, right? But we've known about this thanks to the efforts of the Italian researchers and Timothy Good, who wrote about the crash retrieval back in 1933 in Italy in his classic book, Above Top Secret. So we already knew in broad outline what had happened. There's some Italian work that needs to be translated to English, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more information that is there that the Italian researchers have come up with. Point being is that a deal was worked out between the Pope and the OSS, probably involving General William Donovan and probably some of the assets that were there in Italy in 1944-45 time frame. Okay, one of whom would have been none other than James Jesus Angleton, who was in Italy in 1944-45 time frame. There was also a unit called the Strategic Services Unit, which was later amalgamated into the Central Intelligence Group by General Hoyt Vandenberg, that was operating there in Italy, that may have had a hand in obtaining the Pope didn't want that craft to fall into anyone else's hands other than the Americans. So he worked out this deal whereby the craft and the bodies, and these apparently were Nordic types, were transferred to the Americans. And there is a part in the Above Top Secret book where a French genetics specialist who specialized in working with histones was taken to Wright Pat and was given these samples to study, which bewildered him. He asked to see the specimen from which the samples had come from, and he was taken to this place, probably beneath Wright Pat, where he was shown inside of a glass enclosure these Nordic alien bodies, right? And he could tell by the damage on these corpses that they must have been involved in some kind of a crash or some kind of like a serious accident or something, because some of them were missing limbs and what have you, right? So in all likelihood, my guess is, since the occupants of the craft recovered by the Italians were described as Nordic in appearance, it's quite possible some of those samples that was provided to that geneticist to study, and he was shown, where they came from. It's possible. I'm not saying it's a certainty, but it's possible those bodies came from the craft that was retrieved from the Italians prior to the end of World War II. Because I'm sure that eventually it wound up in America, and that's what's come out in the Grush testimony, etc. So this thing really does go back that far, at least.
Wow, it's fascinating. But is there anything else you wanted to touch on about Rendlesham or the Paul Bennett's case or any of this before we move on? Because we were going to talk a little bit about some of your experiences as well.
Yeah, we can just delve into some of my stuff. Yeah, and if you want to talk mostly about like military kind of stuff, that's fine with me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of people in the audience that have military family. Like I know you're from a military. From a military family. My dad was Vietnam. My grandfather was a POW in World War II. Like my uncles were all in Vietnam. So like I was one of the only people in my family that didn't. I didn't end up going to the military but I know you have a really decorated military history, correct, James? Like
I don't know about the decoration part, but my dad was a combat veteran. Did 2 tours in the Brown Water Navy in Vietnam, Mekong Delta, and if you know what I mean, the Brown Water Navy refers to the Navy patrol boats that not only patrolled offshore of Vietnam. That was called Operation Market Time, but the operation known as Operation Game Warden referred to the operations in the Mekong Delta, along the river, in the rivers, canal systems, estuaries, what have you. And one of their primary objectives in the Brown Water Navy was to interdict the steady flow of reinforcements and supplies coming from the north to arm and basically, enlarge the communist insurgency in South Vietnam by the so-called Viet Cong, which the Vietnamese refer to as the National Liberation Front. Game Warden was so effective that the North Vietnamese, the NVA, had to shift their emphasis, a lot of it, to these covert land routes from North Vietnam through northern Laos into Cambodia, and from there South Vietnam, right? And that's a whole nother story of operations meant to curtail that activity. But point being is that Game Warden was so effective that that's what they had to do. And interesting how this naval operation off-world in our solar system is called Solar Warden, right? Does that have any connection or reference to what they were trying to do in Vietnam with Game Warden? It just, the way my mind thinks, and seeing if there's a connection.
James, a lot of people, I get a story from Daryl Sims when he came on my show. He talked about a whole platoon that was abducted, like in Vietnam. And then there's other people that tell stories of other creatures being like close to the battlefield. Like, have you heard about this? And do you think there's like some ufology that ties into like Vietnam?
Yes, in the book Clear Intent, which was later renamed the UFO Cover-Up by Fawcett and Greenwood, who both worked with Larry Warren, by the way. It was Fawcett and Greenwood and their Freedom of Information Act request on behalf of Larry, which is how the HALT memorandum came into being, right? So in their research, they found out that along the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, 38th parallel, there was all these mysterious helicopters, right? Lots of them. And they couldn't figure out where they came from because they weren't American. The North Vietnamese didn't have that many helicopters, if at all. The Chinese and the Soviets may have supplied them with some, but certainly not enough to account for the activity along the DMZ. And what's interesting is these mysterious black helicopters have been like a core element of all the weird high strangeness in our field, right? A friend of Larry's, the late great Bob Luca, I had him on my show years ago. He was the husband of the late Betty Andreas, and the great series of books, The Andreasen Affair, The Watchers, etc. And I had Bob on the show, and he talked at length about all these black helicopters. And a lot of us have seen these black helicopters. I've seen them. Black helicopters are highly advanced and nearly silent, doing odd, strange things. And I think that at least a significant number of some of these mysterious helicopters are not really helicopters at all. I think some of them are cloaked alien craft. That's just my belief. And even in the 1975 timeframe, there was the inundation of UFOs, including mysterious black helicopters, over the Northern Tier Strategic Air Command bases in America. Loring Air Force Base in Maine these mysterious black helicopters were penetrating the restricted airspace above the weapons storage areas, right? So the point of relevance is these black helicopters have been seen all over the place, including the demilitarized zone separating North and South Vietnam, right? And again, it was a bafflement to military intelligence because they're not ours. They don't belong to the NVA, North Vietnamese Army. So who are they? Where do they come from? Well, what's their purpose, right? So, and then you have another part of the Paul Bennewitz story was, and I had a discussion with William English about this, right? Actually, it's more the William English story, and I first heard about this in the aforementioned UFO crash at Aztec story. William English was in Army Special Forces, and he was tasked with a small team to go into Cambodia and to secure a crash site because this B-52 had basically come under attack by a UFO and had presumably crash landed, right? So they get to this clearing in the Cambodian jungle and they find a B-52, but it hadn't crashed. It looked like it had just been parked there, right? And so he and his team gained access to this B-52 and they found the crewmen still strapped into their seats, but they had been mutilated in the classic human mutilation pattern. Their rectums were cored out, their tongues were excised. It's very similar to what happens with cattle, where parts of their lips were excised and et cetera, and their blood, what's the term, exsanguined, whatever the term means, where their blood is totally extracted from them, so not a drop of blood in the bodies, nor is there any blood inside the plane itself, right? And that's a feature, this anomalous feature of cattle mutilations. It's like, well, somehow something or some way managed to draw all the blood out of these cattle, and there's not a drop of blood anywhere to be seen, right? Well, the same thing happened with the bodies found on the B-52 by William English and his team. They took photographs, right? And some of those same photographs, after English's time in Vietnam, he got a job as a contractor working for the NSA at an NSA listening post at RAF Chicksands in England, right? And in his job was to evaluate raw intelligence. And one fine day, this bundle is dropped into his in tray, and it was Project Blue Book Grudge 13. I think it was what it was called. That's what William English told me when he was on my show. I had him on 2 or 3 times. And he was, flipping through all these pages that talked about this UFO crash retrieval event involving the British Army in Germany, right? The northern part of Germany, near the Baltic Sea. And also, he came across the photos of the mutilated air crewmen in the B-52, which he and his team had photographed. He goes, these are my photographs, and me and my team had boarded that B-52 during the Vietnam War. And, these are the pictures that we took. So that told him that if this is true, and I know these are the photos that myself and my team took, then everything else in this document must be true also. The British Army recovering aliens, this case in Denmark, I think it was, somewhere in Scandinavia, where a civilian took a joyride with these human-looking aliens. His wife panicked, called the authorities. The military and the police showed up. They thought she was crazy until the craft came back and returned her husband, right? And the aforementioned Helga Morrow, she told me that her uncle was a high-level diplomat with the European Union, based in Geneva, Switzerland. And when the subject turned to UFOs and what Helga knows about them and what her father was involved in, Dr. Frederick Augustus Kepbars, this uncle of hers, I don't know if he was related to her father or of the father or the mother's side, whatever the case may be, probably related to her father, said, who worked in the European Union and was a high-level diplomat in Switzerland. She said, Helga, I've flown around in those things, right? So again, it's another piece of the mosaic, a pattern data correlation that whatever has been going on in America, this deep black alien human collusion, has been going on in Europe. Helga Morrow's own uncle had flown around in these spacecraft, right? And we have John Moyen's story, and then I have spoken to people from Croatia, right, when it was still a part of the Soviet Union, and the East Bloc intelligence interest in them as young girls, and later on they wound up being in these weird science programs, first in the Eastern Bloc, and then when they moved to America after the Berlin Wall goes down and communism supposedly collapses, it just really morphed, really. Then they come to the West, come to America, come to Australia, come to other places, and they're still having these deep black, weird science experiences, right? So, I thought that it's a global effort what's going on. And yes, cycling back to your point, I did come from a military family, and so that was in my background, and I think it paved the way for everything that happened to me later on.
Yeah, yeah. And like, did you have, when did you start having experiences with like MILABs and reptilians? From when did that all happen? Like, was that early in life or did it happen later? And when did you start putting it all together that got you interested in the phenomena?
Well, I didn't think there was a connection at first between the times I'd been taken to military hospitals when I was a boy, right? And I had lots of missing time, places like Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in Oakland, the infamous Presidio Army Letterman General Hospital, the Presidio, and other places, right? I didn't really make the connection until much later when I was having a series of these experiences with the Navy, right? Then I thought about it. Man, I had that weird missing time where my mom was instructed by these Navy doctors to give me these sedatives that would knock me out, supposedly, prevent car sickness, right? But really, that was the story they told my mom. So she administered these pills to me before we did the road trip to the medical clinics, the military medical clinics, and they always knocked me out, right? So it was only much later, zooming out, I said, I bet there's a connection between all the times I was taken to those military hospitals when I was a boy and all this weird science stuff that's going on now. Because to answer your question, what happens is when you delve into the subject of reptilians, really delve into the subject of reptilians, the reptilians know about it. Now, I'd been on the reptilians radar anyway because I've been having these abduction experiences, and we know that the reptilians control a number of other alien races, and the reptilians get these other alien races to do a lot of the heavy lifting for them in the form of abductions, medical procedures, et cetera, et cetera. For some special cases, the reptilians will get their hands dirty and work directly with abductees, right? So likewise, the mantis beings. But often it's not always, but frequently, they prefer to operate behind the scenes, right? One of the problems that I had with a lot of the research of Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs was it de-emphasized the reptilian presence, right? When I know, based on all the people, the sheer numbers of people they work with, the story of reptilians must have come up at least once. I know someone personally who was regressed a number of times by David Jacobs, right? And when this gal I know told Jacobs, well, I had a reptilian experience, Jacobs would tell her, no, that was a hybrid that looked like a reptilian, which kind of begs the question, right? Like, if it was a hybrid, why would it look like a reptilian if it was just a hybrid, right? Does it have to look
like why was he trying to ignore that? Like, what was did he have an agenda, you think? It doesn't, I don't know.
One can only speculate. I mean, I don't want to besmirch his good name because he's done good work, but you have to look at this in totality. Like, they used to make dismissive comments about Barbara Bartley, my mentor. Oh, lizard people, reptilians. Go talk to Barbara Bartley about that. That's her specialty, right? They almost said it dismissively. So we had this biased viewpoint that it was grays, and only grays, as well as hybrid variants of the grays, right? And that was it. That was the whole who's who in the alien zoo, the term that LeBain uses, right? Which I like, by the way. No, the reptilians are deeply involved. And when you peer into people's experiences and you regress them and get really deep down in their experiences, often as not, there's more than just grays, in some of these experiences and some of these alien installations and some of these larger, especially larger alien craft, you see a plethora of different types of ETs, reptilians, human-looking beings, mantis beings, insectoids, grays. It's not just grays, right? So when I started delving into reptilians, and something told me. Now, the first time I really delved into the subject, I was listening to, it was KPFA radio. We used to have a great talk show, Guns and Butter, for surface level stuff. Bonnie Faulkner, she was one of the best interviewers I've ever heard, and she would interview everyone about 9/11 and all this other stuff, strictly on the surface level. But that came out of KPFA in Berkeley, California, of all places, right? Well, years before, when I was still living in the San Francisco Bay Area, I happened to catch the tail end of a program on KPFA where they were talking about aliens, right? And one of the stories was about reptilians. And this is a story told by a former U.S. Green Beret who served in Vietnam. After the war, he kept his clearances and began working in construction in underground bases. And that's where the big money is. You have to stop and think about it. Someone's got to lay in the drywall. Someone's got to lay in the electrical wiring, et cetera, right? In fact, I know someone here in Australia who worked in the ACT, the Australian capital of Canberra, and he worked beneath the Parliament buildings, worked beneath the intelligence headquarters in construction. And he'd been in those underground tunnel systems, right? Point being is that if you want to make the big money, that's where the jobs are, in the underground bases, because all the black money just flows endlessly. And this guy who went by the pseudonym Joe, ex-Green Beret, he helped develop underground bases beneath Scott Air Force Base in Illinois and Edwards Air Force Base. He worked beneath Edwards, and he took an elevator down, and he reckoned by how long it took to get to the floor that he exited. And that's not to say it was the bottom. That was just a floor he got off of. He said based on how long it took to get down, he estimated he'd been at least a mile beneath Edwards Air Force Base.
Wow.
And he said he was in a corridor, and he was standing before two very big metallic doors that were slowly swinging shut. And he looked in through the doors before it shut, and there was two human scientists in white lab coats looking up and talking to a big reptilian. The reptilian is looking down at him, talking, and these two human scientists or technicians were looking up at him. Then the doors clanged shut, right? He goes, well, that's interesting. And when I heard that, I'm laying there in a darkened room in San Jose, California. Well, that's interesting. Reptilians. Well, why not? Because my mind went back to all the stories of all these reptilian chimeras in Greek mythology and all the stories about the Nagas in ancient India, etc. So that stuck in my mind. And years later, as fate would have it, that interview that Joe gave to researcher Michael Lindemann, right? That interview, that tape recorded interview, occurred in the living room of my friend Joyce Spivey, who's since passed away, like so many of my colleagues. She had this mysterious death. But anyway, it was through Joyce that I met all these other MILABs and reptilian abductees in the high desert of Southern California. That interview was taped in her living room, she told me, right? And then that interview was released on KPFA. Joe, the Green Beret guy, got really pissed off and put the word out if Michael Lindemann ever shows up. And the interview took place in Victorville, but a lot of the activity that Joe was describing was in Lancaster, Palmdale, the Antelope Valley, where all these aerospace companies and their underground bases are, right? And Joe put the word out, if Michael Lindemann ever comes to the high desert again, he's finished. He was really mad because of all the harassment that was meted out to Joe as a result of Lindemann violating his trust and putting out this tape recorded interview of the guy, right? So again, it just shows. Now, one thing that Lindemann made a point about, and I talked to Bill Hamilton about this, and Bill Hamilton corrected me. He goes, no, Joe was my source before he was Lindemann's source, right? Bill pointed it out to me, right? Because that's how Michael Lindemann found out about him, right? And Lindemann talked about the Lancaster syndrome and how what's going on at S4 Area 51 is just one small part of a much larger pattern. And this has been borne out in some of the testimony of the early MILABs that have come out, like Leah Haley. She was from Alabama, Mississippi, taken to underground bases there, taken to bases on the surface, right, as well. Oh, by the way, the aforementioned Joe, the ex-Green Beret, in one of his jobs at China Lake, he was on the surface in a highly secure part of the surface facility, and he and his construction colleagues had seen 3 or 4 little grays through a window. One of his colleagues was so obsessed by this during their time working at that facility at China Lake. One of his colleagues kept sneaking over and looking through the windows at these grays, right? And eventually, as Joe said in the interview, which I heard, that fellow construction worker disappeared, and they found his body a month later in Orange County. So apparently the guy couldn't keep his mouth shut. He kept going back there when they told him not to look at the grays, and curiosity killed the cat, so to speak, right? So he winds up dead, just one of many people in our field who've had untimely deaths. But cycling back to your question, when I started delving into reptilians after I moved to San Diego, I started talking to Sean Atlanti, the founder of the San Diego UFO Society, and he started talking about reptilian cases in the high desert, right? And he talked about how there was total military involvement. And something about him saying that there's a lot of reptilians, people having reptilian encounters in the high desert, Edwards Air Force Base, China Lake, George Air Force Base, Victorville, that whole area. And that became, later, I investigated large swaths of those areas. He said, lots of rep experiences, total military involvement. And when he said that, it really like rang alarm bells in me, right? Because I had no issue transitioning from, okay, grays, this kind of race, that kind of race, reptilians. That made perfect sense to me. There was no transitional period where I had to convince myself that they were real. And then I met Barbara Bartholick, and her whole emphasis was on reptilians. So, and other alien beings. But what happened at that point, I was delving in so deeply into it. The reptilians themselves got involved in my life, started abducting me. Sometimes they show up pretending to be military, but they were really reptilians. And there were times that they took me to their base. And the particular reptilians that were interacting with me shared the same underground facility in the high desert in Apple Valley, to be specific. Apple Valley is right next to Victorville. And beneath a mountain, and I talked about this before, beneath this mountain was an underground base that was jointly operated by the Navy and reptilians. The surface of that base, I guess they tried eminent domain. It didn't work, right? Where they just, like the Manhattan Project, they just move into Tennessee and Washington and just buy out all these people's homes, throw them a bone of, undervalued property. They should have been paid, top value. No, the government came in, threw them a bone, said this is all now restricted military activity, and it became part of the Manhattan Project. Well, they may have tried that at that mountain in Apple Valley, but I guess it didn't work because they then resorted to burning off the homesteaders. We've seen this in the recent past in Hawaii and the Pacific Palisades and other places. They just burned these people up, all right, on the surface, on top of this mountain. And the first firefighting units to show up, get this, were from Fort Irwin, a federal firefighting unit that showed up from Fort Irwin 60 miles away, right? So like what happened to the local firefighting units? They weren't around. But the federal firefighting unit does show up. And then before too long, they put a steel fence around the summit and it became restricted. There was armed military personnel with, flak vests and M16s that were guarding the perimeter, right? Beneath that base is a joint Army and a Navy reptilian facility, which I'd been taken to on a number of occasions. And 2 members of my team One of them was Diane Johnson, who was a close friend of Joyce Spivey's. She was one of the original MILABs. She was an experienced remote viewer. In fact, when she was much younger, she was tasked by the Deep Black military to locate these missing hydrogen bombs. If you're familiar with the story, I think it was a B-52 had a problem off of Spain and jettisoned like 2 or 4 hydrogen bombs. I can't remember the exact number, and they were trying to recover them. Well, one of the jobs they made Diane Johnson do was remote view and see if she could find the location of one of these missing hydrogen bombs. But anyway, further down the track, we were working with Diane, and then she remote viewed the interior of that underground base. And we also had another friend of mine who's probably passed away by now, a former Navy submariner, who was also an abductee and remote viewer. He remote viewed Dulcie and came out of that experience like really traumatized, right? This was an old guy who was also a reverend, by the way, covered with tattoos, an old sailor of the old school variety. And he remotely viewed beneath Dulcie, and what he saw just shocked him so much. But anyway, he remotely viewed the same underground base that Diane Johnson had that we'd been taken to, and his descriptions of the interior of this base matched almost precisely with what Diane described, even to the point of this part of the mountain where the mountaintop would open up and these craft inside would fly out, right? And he could only describe them as looking like big kite-looking things, but he didn't really know if they were human craft or they were alien. But apparently, they had a number of these inside the base, and similar to the underground base in the Hatchie Mountains and Dulcie and other places, parts of the mountain literally either open up, slide open, or in some of the alien bases, there's some kind of force field illusionary effect where the craft can just fly in and out without anything opening up. In fact, what the alien beneath Bentwaters said to Larry Warren was, in so many words, and this is all telepathic, we have the means to make the 2 bases on the surface, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, vanish. And Larry felt that the alien meant that literally. And with the benefit of hindsight, we now know some of my experiences, I would say, that were involving the Navy. I'm satisfied that not only did they involve off-world experiences, but also an alternate reality, for lack of a better term. Because one of my close friends, Lorena Smith, who I've had on the show, she and I were together taken beneath that base. The aforementioned Joyce Spivey introduced me to Lorena, and I began spending a lot of time at her house because there was so much reptilian activity there, right? And the Navy told her that they have long since had the means to go to other dimensions and other realities. And they explained the process to her, but she said, I'm just a housewife from Apple Valley. All this physics didn't make any sense to me, right? So, and then when I reread that statement, the alien said that we can make the bases vanish. And then in the recent past, you've had our old friend Tyler Koala on probably in the recent past, and he talked about alternate realities where he would go to these alternate realities and he would go to some of these bases and they either have counterparts in this reality or they haven't been constructed yet, right? And so when the alien told Larry that we have the means to make these bases on the surface vanish, and then with the benefit of hindsight, with my own experiences and what Tyler's talking about, what others are talking about, I think the alien is talking about, could be talking about the fact that alternate realities can be accessed, right? And what they told Lorena is they've been doing that. We have bases set up in these other dimensions and other realities, entire installations, which I've seen. And I've also been taken to a place which I can only describe as it's on a mountaintop, and in a big clearing, there is what amounts to a huge mansion or estate in this clearing, right? In the summit of this mountain. And it's run by the Navy. And oddly enough, even though it's an ornate looking, not really overly ornate, but you can tell it's a good looking place. But the naval personnel that I saw, the enlisted personnel and the junior officers tended to wear green BDUs, similar to what you'd see the Navy Seabees wear, or some Navy SEALs wear, were just plain green, right? And I saw a lot of those personnel, and also officers in sometimes in khaki uniforms, sometimes in or more formal wear. And in some of these experiences, I'm satisfied I was in an alternate personality, not only alternate reality, but the me you're talking to was shunted somehow into the back seat. And I was talking to a survivor of these high-level satanic families who'd been present when these off-worlders would come and taking part in the off-world human slave trade, right? And he said that Draco would show up, but there were times when the other aliens he'd never seen would show up and talk to high-level members of these hybrid families on Earth, and discussions about off-world human trafficking and whatnot. And I was trying to make a point about this. He told me something about, what he told me was, when I explained the syndrome, that like these military personnel are talking to me, and it's clear they're pausing and they're listening to my response. It's clear. But what's interesting is I can't hear a word of it, right? I'm only along for the ride. I'm sitting in the back seat. So like this officer sitting across from me asked me a question, looking right at me. And then he paused, and it's clear he was listening to something I was saying. But paradoxically, I couldn't hear a word. It was like everything was on mute. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I asked him about that. He said, well, in all likelihood, it sounds like they put you in the back seat somehow. Some kind of altar was pulled to the front, and that's who they were interacting with, right? And I think at times that altar has bled through into my normal waking consciousness, at times, just every once in a while, just that mentality kind of comes through. But basically, most of my experiences had been with Navy personnel. And what I sensed, intuited, some of them were Navy SEALs that were like sheep dipped into the super deep black project. And seeing military personnel, high-level naval officers in conferences. And like I said, I'd been on some of these off-world vessels in the interior of them. And just anywhere you want to go with that.
Well, I'm almost out of time. I was going to say, this was amazing, though, James. I'd love to have you back on for like a part 2. Like this is so good. I think the audience like really loved it. But I was just going to say, is there anything you'd like to say before we finish up? And this was really good. I mean, it's always really good,
Yeah. Sorry, I was rambling. I was just rambling.
I feel like it's like we need this information to come out. You know what I mean? It's like it's really important, and you're like one of the key players, as far as like bringing this information forward. I think, but real information, like not just like,
thank you, because we need to pay homage to the Paul Bentwaters, to the William Englishes, to the Larry Warrens, to all the greats of the past, because they provided background information. One of the earliest references that I remember, 2 very quickly, because I know you got to go, and I got to get my day started here also. Katarina Wilson, one of the first female MILABs to come out with her own books. Leah Haley was another one. In Katarina Wilson's books, she talked about being on these space vessels. And on one occasion, she'd seen a gray in the corridor of the space vehicle. She could look out the windows and see outer space, right? And then she went running down this corridor because she was so excited. She'd seen an alien, and she'd seen him many times before, but she knew she was on a human craft, at least a craft where humans were present. And she came across this conference table where these naval officers were seated, and they were having a discussion. She tried to get their attention, say, look, there's a gray alien there. They didn't even pay attention to her. Like, what's the big deal? We're having a conference. Can you see that? Right? So point being is that to me was an early example. Could that have been Solar Warden or an offshoot of it? Could the program that I was in beneath that underground base in Apple Valley. Could that have been part of Solar Warden? It's possible. Because like they told Lorena, we operate not only off-world, but we operate in alternate realities and alternate dimensions. And a lot of my experiences seem to have been in alternate realities also, right? And then another quick point that Bill Hamilton made decades ago, and I'll leave you with this. I managed to get him on the same bill as me for a conference in Philadelphia that my late friend Bob Urey put together, right? And Bob Urey put a conference together, and I helped him get some of the speakers. And Bill Hamilton was one of the speakers I helped him to get. And I'd had private conversations with Bill before this, but never really in depth. But at his lecture in Philadelphia, this would have been 97, 98, right? He talked about, according to the sources he developed in the Antelope Valley, not only was Bob Lazar absolutely legit, right? But the sources that he was in comms with were interacting with aliens on an almost daily basis, and they told him there was an American underground base on Mars, right?
Wow.
And he said some of the craft that they flew to Mars that were man-made would take 3 or 4 days to get there, right? To give you an idea, right? But some of them were much faster than that. So here he is, late 1990s, talking about an underground base on Mars. Katarina Wilson talking about being on a space vessel with naval personnel and aliens. And from the research efforts that myself and Evie Lorgan and others had done in Southern California, we determined there was some kind of a jump gate or some kind of a stargate in an underground facility offshore of San Diego, right? That there's a similar off-world underground operation conducted by the Navy off of San Diego. So we were hearing these stories, the late 80s, 90s. Jim Goodall, I've had him on the show. His sources told him in the early 80s, probably going back to the 70s now, that they had not only an operation in Area 51 involving aliens and alien technology, but they had a Mars program too. And I consider Jim Goodall to be one of the top researchers in our field, right? So
wow.
Just making the point that this whole concept of off-world, Mars, naval space vessels, this had been going on for a long time, and they will never go in that direction in these congressional hearings. So I'll leave it there.
I agree, James. And I think that's why it's so important what you're saying, because it seems like they're not only trying to, it's the cover up, like you said, they're not going to ever give us full disclosure, like the name of Brian's conference, like full disclosure. Now that's what we want. We want full disclosure of the MILAB abductions, the alien abductions, the ritual abuse, the secret space programs, all this stuff that needs to really come to the forefront so the public can get a better understanding of what's really actually transpiring in our reality and other realities too.
How deeply we're involved in it too. That it's just what they're talking about in the congressional hearings is the tip of the iceberg, and they won't even go in the directions that they need to go. So anyhow, thank you for having me on, Robert. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, honestly, yeah. Like I said, I feel like you're one of the best researchers we have in ufology, and it's an honor every time you come on my show, James. Honestly, and
well, it's an honor talking to you, buddy. You're a major player in all this too, and it was a pleasure hanging out with you at Full Disclosure. We had a blast. So let's do it again.
I did have a blast. It was fun. Do you want to tell people? Jason put your website up, but do you want to tell people how they can find you and how they can follow you and stuff? And
yeah, you can find me on Facebook, James Bartley. You can find me on Twitter, Cosmic Switch 29. I'm not on there as often, but mostly on Facebook. And you can also go to my website, thecosmicswitchboard.com, and then there's a means to contact me there as well. If you want to share your experiences, if you got any information you want to share or bounce off of me, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And thank you guys. Thank you so much, James. And thank you everybody for tuning in today. And I'll be live again today, guys. And thank you everyone. And